High cholesterol is a condition caused almost entirely by our dietary pattern, apart from in very rare genetic instances. And it's seriously risky. High cholesterol is a causal risk factor in what's known as atherosclerosis. This is fatty deposits building up on the inner walls of your arteries and restricting blood flow. Eventually, when they get big enough, these fatty plaques in our arteries can rupture and block blood flow entirely. This is a heart attack, or if it happens in the brain, a stroke. And let me be clear here, heart disease is the single greatest threat, the #1 killer of people worldwide. It's statistically what we're most likely to die from. So if there was anywhere to start when it came to healthy habits, I think this would be it. Now, since high cholesterol has such a big dietary factor associated with it, this is actually good news. It means that we have the control, we have the power to influence our health destiny simply by what we put in our mouths for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So in this video, I'm going to share with you the top 10 worst foods to eat if you have high cholesterol. These are what I would consider to be perhaps the biggest culprits when it comes to raising our cholesterol and increasing our risk of heart disease. So if you're able to eliminate, or at the very least dramatically reduce your intake of these foods, you're very likely to increase your chances of living a long, healthy, vibrant life. Let's go, friend. I'm Dr. Ryan Williams, your host and the founder of Growing Pure, where I help you achieve health and vitality through delicious vegan food. The #1 food on my list is coconut oil and coconut cream. Now, coconut oil and coconut cream are extremely high in saturated fat. This is the type of fat that has no carbon-carbon double bonds. It's all saturated with hydrogen. And it's this type of fat that really drives our cholesterol up. So saturated fat in general is really something we want to be trying to keep to a minimum if we have high cholesterol and we're trying to lower it. So quite uncommonly amongst plant foods, coconuts are quite high in saturated fat. Now, coconuts themselves, if you were to kind of eat a fresh coconut, well, there's lots of water and lots of fiber in there. So even though it is quite high in saturated fat, it's not a concentrated source, and you're probably going to get quite full of all that fiber and water before you can eat too much of it. But coconut oil and cream, well, these are highly processed, refined coconut products where all that water and fiber has been stripped out and you're left with pretty much just saturated fat. In fact, Dr. Neil Barnard likes to say that if coconut oil had any more saturated fat, it would be engine grease. So try and get the coconut oil and cream out of your diet as much as possible. Enjoy the odd fresh coconut pieces. I think that would be a nice way of enjoying that flavor of coconut, but try and avoid that coconut oil and cream. #2 food is cheese. Wow, cheese is extremely high in saturated fat as well. It's a very concentrated product, right? So it's made from milk, but milk is mostly water, whereas cheese is solid, and that's because all of that water has been stripped away, so you're really concentrating down all of that saturated fat. So each mouthful of cheese you have, compared to a mouthful of milk, has a lot more saturated fat in it that's going to drive up our cholesterol. But not only that, cheese, like all animal products really, has dietary cholesterol in it, right? So it comes from an animal, it already has cholesterol in there. And this dietary cholesterol does in fact raise our cholesterol as well. Now, there's a lot of confusion about this, and it's a really strange story of industry influence and nefarious study design, and I think it deserves its own video. But the long story short is, yes, dietary cholesterol does raise our blood cholesterol, but not really to the same extent as saturated fat. But in any case, cheese has lots of both saturated fat and cholesterol. So it's really something we want to be keeping to a minimum to see our cholesterol coming down. #3 is eggs. Now, eggs are often seen as quite a healthy food, but they are perhaps the most cholesterol-rich food that we have. Now, dietary cholesterol, again, it doesn't have quite the same impact as saturated fat does, but it does still have a real impact on our blood cholesterol. So if we're really trying to get our cholesterol down, we don't want to be eating extra cholesterol. So eggs are really a problem there. Eggs are commonly cited as being low in saturated fat, but I want to look at whether that's actually true. With eggs, 19% of their calories come from saturated fat. Now, for some context here, the recommended amount of calories that we should be getting from saturated fat should be not more than 10%, really. Ideally less than that, closer to 5%. So let's compare eggs at their 19% calories from saturated fat with some other foods. Or maybe you have your eggs on toast. So what about that whole wheat bread? How much saturated fat is coming from that? Well, only 2.3%. Or what about bacon? Maybe you'll have your eggs with bacon in a breakfast. Bacon, which is commonly thought of as a very high-fat food, is 23% of calories coming from saturated fat, so not that much higher than the 19% in eggs. And then think about what you might have in place of eggs. Maybe you're going to have some scrambled tofu for breakfast instead of eggs. Well, how many calories are coming from saturated fat in tofu? It's only about 8%. Or maybe for breakfast, you decide to ditch the eggs and go for some oatmeal instead. Well, with oats, only around about 2.6% of their calories are coming from saturated fat. So I think just by looking at the numbers, calling eggs low in saturated fat would be disingenuous. They're pretty high in saturated fat. Lower than something like cheese or coconut oil, but still quite high. The number 4 food to avoid is going to be animal fats. So we're thinking of things like lard, beef tallow, goose fat, butter, and ghee. So these animal fats are going to be pretty much entirely saturated fat, kind of like the coconut oil. But then you've got the additional cholesterol coming as well. So I think of all of the foods on this list, these concentrated animal fats are probably the worst offenders. Cut these out if you want to lower your cholesterol. The number 5 worst food if you have high cholesterol is going to be partially hydrogenated fats, or margarines it could be. These are kind of sneaky because there's quite a few names for them. You might see them called shortening, or hydrogenated fats, or mono and diglycerides of fatty acids. These are all slightly nefarious ways of saying what they are, which is partially hydrogenated fats. Well, what actually are these? Well, you take a vegetable oil, a vegetable fat that's liquid at room temperature, and through an industrial process you can what's called hydrogenate it, and this makes it solid at room temperature. The real issue here is that this process will create what are known as trans fats. So trans fats, they appear in small quantities in animal foods, but generally they're found in these processed hydrogenated vegetable fats, and they are extremely injurious to our arteries. In fact, the health consequences of trans fats are so clear that they've been banned in the United States, for instance. But even so, you will still find them in foods. You really want to be keeping these to an absolute minimum. The trans fats are not your friend if you are wanting to lower your cholesterol. So check the label of the foods you buy, see if it says something about hydrogenated fats, and certainly margarines you want to be really careful because these are solid vegetable fats, which means they've probably been hydrogenated. The number 6 food are baked goods, things like pastries, donuts, and cakes. These will tend to have quite a lot of these trans fats in them. Additionally, they're going to have very often an oil called palm oil. Similar to coconut oil, this is a plant fat, but it's very high in saturated fat. And these kind of processed baked goods will tend to have trans fats and this palm oil saturated fat in them. Additionally, of course, it's not uncommon for them to be made with butter or eggs, and we have the same problems we've already discussed with those foods. Next up is fried foods. Now, foods that are deep fried are going to be generally fried in vegetable oils. Now, vegetable oils usually have somewhere around, say, 12% saturated fat in them, so it's not exactly very low, but it's not nearly as high as some of the other foods we've talked about here. So what is the problem with fried foods? Well, the problem is that under these extremely high temperature conditions, you've got to remember that cooking oil is going to be perhaps 200 degrees Celsius or more. We can actually create new trans fats in these conditions, and they will get into the food that we're going to be eating. So we tend to see quite consistently that consumption of fried foods is going to be associated quite strongly with poorer artery health and with our cholesterol going up. So try and enjoy your vegetables, your potatoes, rather than deep fried, have them baked or steamed or boiled, something like that. The number 8 worst food is going to be processed meat products, things like sausages, salami, deli meats, bacon, things like that. Aside from these foods being listed as a class 1 carcinogen, meaning they cause cancer, the other problem here for our purposes is that they're high in saturated fat and cholesterol. And perhaps in contrast to things like butter or lard or even coconut oil, these are foods that, whilst they're very high in saturated fat, you're not going to use a lot of them generally. Perhaps you'll have a little bit as a sort of condiment, if you like, for your meal. But with these meat products, it's not uncommon for us to eat lots of it, right? So even though the saturated fat and cholesterol isn't quite as concentrated, you're going to be eating a lot of it. So they actually become a very significant source of saturated fat and cholesterol just because of how much more we tend to eat of these products. The number 9 worst food might surprise you. It's ice cream. Now, ice cream, it's very sugary, so we want to keep eating that sweet taste, but it's, again, a concentrated dairy fat. There's going to be a lot of saturated fat and cholesterol in here. It's really going to bump up our blood cholesterol. And finally, the number 10 worst food if you have high cholesterol is going to be meat in general, red or white meat. I think there's a perception that white meats like chicken are a lot healthier than red meats. And perhaps in certain respects, like their capacity to cause cancer, that might be true. But when it comes to our cholesterol, it's really not much of a difference. In fact, we can actually see that a majority of dietary cholesterol comes from things like chicken because people eat more of it because they think it's a healthier food, so they don't really hold back on it at all. But even when these meats are unprocessed, they still contain much the same amount of saturated fat and cholesterol. Okay, so the processing into sausages or bacon or mincemeat doesn't take out or add any saturated fat or cholesterol usually. It's already in there, right? So even if it's unprocessed, it's still not going to be good for our blood cholesterol. So there you have it. Those are my top 10 suggested worst foods if you have high cholesterol. If you are able to cut out or reduce the amount of these foods that you're eating, it's very, very likely you're going to see improvements in your blood cholesterol. And this is going to lower your risk for heart disease, our number 1 killer, and allow you to live a long, disease-free, vibrant life, which is what I want for you. Now, to say thank you for being here with me and watching this video, I want to give you a free gift. This is my 1-page summary of how to lower cholesterol naturally. It talks a little bit more about what we've discussed in this video, as well as the foods that we should be eating to get our cholesterol down and the ideal target numbers that we are aiming for. If that would be helpful to you, please click on the link in the description below. It is all yours, friend. And if you would like to go a little bit deeper on this topic, get a more broad understanding of cholesterol and how to lower it, then I think you would enjoy my video on how to lower cholesterol naturally. If you would like to watch that, you can click right here. I want to thank you so much for watching, friend, and I will see you in the next video.